Okay, good morning everyone and welcome. I am Stacy Walker. I'm the Education and Program Coordinator here at New Canaan Cares. And we're thrilled to have Tracy and Frank with us today. I'm going to give you a little bit of background on Tracy and Frank. Dr. Frank Bartolomeo is Director of Adolescent Services at Silver Hill Hospital, where he has overall responsibility for the inpatient, residential, and intensive outpatient programs for teens with mental health difficulties. He is a frequent presenter at schools and youth serving programs, as well as at national conferences. He maintains a private psychotherapy training and consultation practice in Wilton. And Tracy Masella, she's a licensed clinical social worker, is a private practitioner in Wilton, Connecticut. Ms. Masella worked at Silver Hill Hospital in New Canaan, Connecticut for 10 years, most recently as the program manager for the Adolescent Transitional Living Program. She's now a marketing consultant for Silver Hill. Ms. Masella is intensively trained in dialectical behavior therapy and works with adults and adolescents with a full range of mood and personality disorders. So we welcome them today for their presentation on healthy emotion regulation in uncharted waters. Welcome.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Stacy. I'm going to get started. I want to first thank Stacy for having Frank and I. Frank and I have known each other for years, and we adore speaking together. One day we're gonna take it on the road, right, Frank? Also want to thank Sarah Schubert for her guidance of New Canaan Cares through the pandemic. Stacy and Sarah were able to put together a fall program roster, even when we didn't know whether we were going to be leaving our house. So I think that was admirable. And congratulations to Judy Phillips, who I think just joined, being named Executive Director of New Canaan Cares, so carrying on the legacy of this amazing organization. So thank you for that. So we're going to talk about the thing that is coming up for everybody these days is how do we regulate these emotions that are all over the place during this pandemic. I wanted to start with talking a little bit about how emotions work, right? So emotions are not just sad, angry, happy. They're a whole constellation of feelings, thoughts, and behaviors that make up the emotional experience, right? And the more we are aware of what we are feeling, thinking, and doing, the better we are able to manage it, right? So information is power. Knowing what we are experiencing emotionally will help us with the regulation, right? So let's just think about the brain. Here's my brain, see? Thankfully, everybody's brain operates the same, right? So this is a very simplistic understanding of how the brain works in the emotional experience, right? So the first part of the brain that is triggered in an emotional experience and triggered by something internal, could be a thought, or triggered by something external, like a sound or an experience. It doesn't have to be this big, huge thing that triggers our brain. That part of the brain is called the amygdala. It's way back here in our brain. And it's the most primitive part of our brain. And its function is crucial to our survival. It's the part of our brain that keeps us alive. Okay, so it's constantly on the lookout for anything that might be dangerous or anything that might be pleasurable, because we need both of those things to stay alive. We need to stay out of danger and we need to have pleasure in our life. So that amygdala is constantly surveying our environment and our brain to see what's going on. And if it gets triggered, the first thing that happens is it sends all this neuronal information down to our body, so below the neck. So the mind operates the body. And that's when we get feelings, right? So feelings are physical sensations as a response to a trigger in our environment, right? So some of the things that happen when we're having a feeling would be our heart starts to race, or our stomach does a flip-flop, or our cheeks will blush, or our eyes will tear up, or we'll get shaky. All of those things are just a physical response to the amygdala saying something's happening in your environment that you need to pay attention to. And this is happening all the time. And most of us ignore it unless it's a really big thing. But it's important to know this because kids will often react to their body sensations more than adults do, right? So kids will come to you and say, my tummy hurts, or I have a headache, or, you know, I feel like I can't breathe, right? And we often dismiss that, like, oh, you're fine, sweetie, don't worry about it. That's something that we should really pay attention to, right? So we should maybe dig a little deeper in that and say, hey, what's going on? Let's sit down. Let's see what's going on. Because kids are much more in tune to their body sensations than we are. We become desensitized to it, especially when we get older, and there's so many things happening with our body, right? We don't pay attention to these, but kids do. So the second thing that happens in the emotional experience is our frontal cortex gets involved, right? And we all know by now that the frontal cortex is not fully developed until 25, but it's still operating, even when kids are little, right? So the frontal cortex is the part of our brain that's responsible for planning, organization. It's what we call the thinking or the reasonable part of our brain, right? But it's not always so reasonable. But that's the second part of the emotional experience. We start to think about what's happening, and the thoughts that we ascribe to these feelings are completely dependent on our own experience, right? Another important thing to know is vulnerabilities, right? So anything that's happening in your world, either on a daily basis or just that day, is going to impact how we react to that experience, okay? So some common vulnerabilities are lack of sleep, poor eating, caffeine, nicotine, too much sugar, right? Lack of exercise, and being lonely, right? All of these things are very common vulnerabilities. And when we're not attending to those very basic needs that our body has, we make ourselves more vulnerable to having an extreme emotional reaction, okay? So I think all of you can relate to this. If you don't sleep well, the next morning you wake up, you're super cranky, you're irritable, it's gonna be a much harder day. So what do? We go to, you know, our local coffee shop and we get caffeine, right? Which makes us even more vulnerable because we have these kind of spikes in our energy level, right? But all of that makes us more vulnerable to having an extreme emotional reaction. Now, some of these things are outside of our control. I don't know if any of you guys know this, but we're actually currently in a pandemic. And that is the meta vulnerability for all of us right now. Every single one of us is being affected by this, okay? Oops, somebody's not on mute. So that is a huge vulnerability that we are all dealing with, but that impacts our ability to manage our emotions effectively, okay? So we've got the feelings, which are operated by the amygdala, then our thoughts get involved and we start thinking about what's going on. And the next thing that is part of the emotional experience is behavior, right? How do we act? And often that's the first thing that we see about somebody's emotional experience is how they're acting. And kids, Frank, I know you'll agree with this. Kids act, they don't talk, right? So if you're expecting your kid to sit down and say, you know, Mom, I had a really hard day today. You know, my stomach started to act up, and then I thought, what's going on in my life? Susie didn't ask me to do the FaceTime with everybody this afternoon, and I felt sad. And then I felt a little angry. You're never going to have that conversation with your kid, right? But you are going to see your kid come home or come out of their room, slam a door, say something snarky, and that's your cue that that behavior is saying that that kid is having some sort of an emotional experience, right? So we often react to the behavior, but we don't really know what's going on behind the scene, okay? So feelings, thoughts, behavior, that's all part of the emotional experience, right? And so what we're going to talk about now, Frank's going to take over, is we're going to talk about how you manage that experience without either overreacting or moving into problem solving, okay? That's the trap of parenthood, is problem solving. So Frank, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. First of all, I just want to thank Stacy and New Canaan Cares for having us on. As Tracy mentioned, I enjoy presenting with Tracy, and it's always generally pretty fun. So I just want to start. I always begin when I'm on these kind of discussions about parenting. I always begin by saying, you know, I always have some suspicion of parenting experts, because often we make it sound very easy. And what I want to say to you is that during this presentation, I'm going to maybe offer some sage advice or techniques or whatever, and then I'm going to go home tonight and mess it up with my kids. So one of the things we're going to talk about, because it's impossible to talk about emotional regulation with our children without talking about co-regulation. And so I'm going to share my screen with you. And, you know, over the last 20 years or so, we've learned a lot about brain development, and it's affected how we think about parenting and how we help children, you know, regulate. And let's see, Tracy went over some of this, so I'm sorry that I'm redundant. Now, I just want to be clear that probably none of us were actually parented in this way, because we didn't have this knowledge, and whatever was done was done intuitively. But as Tracy mentioned, there are two interconnected brain systems that are highly related to how we parent our children. And she mentioned the amygdala and the limbic system, also known as the emotional brain, and the prefrontal cortex. And we talk about mindful parenting, we're talking first about being mindful of our own experience. Because I'm going to show you that when a child's in a state of emotional dysregulation and we get triggered and we're in a state of emotional dysregulation, things tend to escalate. So in the mindful parenting approach, it's always about attending first to your own emotional state before correcting, directing, or problem solving with our children. And that's relatively new. So again, we evolved this what's called the tripartite brain. We have the reptilian brain, which are our brain stem, which controls those fight or flight reactions or freeze. And then mammals came along, and we developed this emotional brain. And we share that with all mammals. And it allows us to experience very deep emotions about our children and to communicate with other mammals non-verbally. That's why dogs and therapy dogs or other kind of mammals can sort of experience and kind of know what we're feeling. So this is known as these emotional reactions, these automatic emotion-driven, are coming from the bottom up. And as we'll see, when that happens, our most human part of the brain, the last that came along in evolution, the cortex, can go offline. And, you know, the other piece about mindful parenting that we have to at some point explore is really to think about how we were parented, and particularly how our parents responded to us at a time of high emotion or when we were in a time of need. So if our parents were dismissive, told us to, you know, pull up our big boy pants, whatever it was, when under stress, we tend to adopt those deeply ingrained patterns with our own children. So I like to talk about there's parenting when we're not in a state of stress, which most of us then are able to do the right things and be responsive to our children. But under stress, we tend to resort to these more automatic responses that often have to do with how we were parented. So let's see. So we talked about the prefrontal cortex. And of course, that will help us kind of cool down. And essentially what we're doing when we're regulating our children is we're lending our prefrontal cortex to their emotional experience. Let's see. So this was developed by Dan Siegel, and who's kind of the father of interpersonal neurobiology, which is the science of how experience shapes our brains. And so he has this metaphor or this image of using our hands to appreciate the different parts of the brain. So this part down here would be kind of brainstem, spinal cord. The middle part of our hand and thumb, the thumb would be kind of the amygdala.
Anything to throw out or no?
And our fingers would represent our cerebral cortex. Well, when our children, when we have these bottom-up experiences, we can all flip our lids. So this is the diagram for that. And this is something you can talk about with your children and acknowledge at times when we flip our lids, what can happen is, and when in that state, we bring that to our children's emotional upset, and it tends to escalate. And this is what we mean by the upstairs and downstairs brain. So the thinking, some of the empathy, play, and these lower levels automatic functions. And the emotions, you know, what Tracy was saying, that sometimes we're triggered not by external events, but internal events. And that can trigger these emotional responses, and we can go into fight-flight modes as if we are in danger, imminent danger. In fact, I make a comparison between fear and anxiety. Fear is the automatic response to imminent threat that we evolved to be able to escape danger by engaging in 3 types of behavior: fight, flight, or freeze, or shut down or playing dead. And anxiety is an internal event where we're reacting to an imagined danger as if, and it sends the same signals to our body as if we were an imminent threat. So that's kind of the anxiety. It's a physiological, psychophysiological response to an imagined event in the future that's not here yet, but evokes the same kind of, more primitive responses. So again, when our emotional brain is hijacked, our thinking brain tends to become suppressed. The same thing happens to our children. So we probably all had the experience when our children are highly emotionally upset, to try to reason with them. Mm-hmm. That doesn't work because that brain isn't online, and it will tend to just make things even worse, or make them escalate or become more enraged. Mm-hmm. So there's been a lot of research on emotional regulation, and it's linked to all sorts of good outcomes. And again, we're all in the process. I think most people need help, especially when they're under stress, about how do we improve our emotional regulation. That's certainly where some of the self-care, mindfulness comes in. And of course, in addition to the tripartite brain, the reptilian brain, limbic brain, and kind of more human brain, our brain is divided into spheres, and they communicate by something called the corpus callosum that allows those 2 spheres to communicate. When we come into the world, infants are all right brain. And it's also where play, creativity comes in. And then as we evolve, we become more left brain. And the best state of human functioning is when we have when we have whole brain integration. So if we get cut off from our left brain, we become very emotional. And if we're cut off from our right brain, we become so logical that we become robotic. So in DBT, that Tracy knows a great deal about, we call this wise mind. And here's one of the books that I mentioned by Dan Siegel and Tina Payne Bryson. So here's what we've learned about parenting now. We were previously taught that when our child misbehaved, that we had to give consequences right away for them to be effective. What we know now is that's not true, because we've all had the experience of giving our child consequences when they're in a state of upset, and it escalates. So first, what we want to do is, being in control of ourselves, is to bring our calming brain to them. Now that might mean, before we have a discussion, we might have to take a time out. This is also different, to get ourselves better regulated, so we can lend our calmness or thinking to our children. So this is very different than I think most of us were raised, or when we became upset, we often got scolded, or whatever, dismissed, and that tends to cause us to escalate. So these are some of the ways that we connect. First, these are all nonverbal. This is all right brain activity. This is the nonverbals that these are the things that other mammals who don't have language pick up. And this is the stuff that we with our prefrontal cortex development and language, we can bring solutions, planning, all of that to help regulate our emotional brains. So Tracy mentioned this, one of the things that we do is, we call it name it to tame it. So children may not have language to identify these physiological states that we associate with emotion. And part of parenting is we begin to reflect back to I hope other things aren't popping up on my email here. Let's see. Sorry about that.
You're good, Frank.
Okay. So by giving words to these physiological states, children begin to learn to say, oh, this is anger. Oh, when I get, when I get this tightness in my stomach, or my cheeks flush, this is anger, or this is sadness. You look sad. Those we help create language for children so they can begin to make sense of experience. And the more we can kind of drill down, it's called emotional granularity, the more we can drill down. So someone might often say, some kids in my program, I might ask how they're doing, and they'll say fine. And I'll never accept that, of course. And I'll say, well, I know what fine means for me. What does it mean for you? And we start drilling down. Or if they say they're sad, we might start drilling down about sad might also include frustration. So the more granular we can get, the better able we can experience, some regulation over our emotions.
Yeah, Frank,
but first, jump in.
Yeah, so that's a key point, I think, is learning your kids' emotional language as well as your own, right?
Mm-hmm.
But learning what they mean when a kid says, I'm upset, or
Right.
I feel bad, right? Those are
Mm-hmm.
not emotion words. So we have
Right.
to learn what those mean, right? What does bad mean for your kid? Your kid might tend towards sadness or fear or anxiety, whereas bad for another kid might be really heavily weighted on anger, right?
Mm-hmm.
So learning your kids' emotional language and helping them to tease out what it really means to feel bad.
Right. Right. And again, this might mean first getting into a calming state and approaching their emotional experience with curiosity rather than judgment. So a lot of us were, as we were parented, a lot of our emotions were met with judgment, and we then got a sense of, oh, this is a bad emotion, this is an okay emotion. And then when we get those messages, what can happen is we will experience shame when we have certain emotions. So again, we try to approach our children and the other important people in our lives, by the way, spouses and even ourselves, to be approached with curiosity, rather than judgment. I'm sort of getting into some strategies here, and maybe we might want to hold off on that, but these are some of the ways that we can also problem solve with our children. And sometimes jumping into problem solve can actually, without connecting first, can actually escalate things, because they're getting flooded with our words, our ideas, and they're still in a state of trying to calm their emotions. So with kids, talking about, what are your thoughts about how to deal with this? What are your thoughts about how to deal with your boredom or your restlessness? Rather than just going in and offering solutions that then tend to get easily rejected.
Right. And can feel very invalidating.
Right.
So you may be problem solving something that the kid doesn't actually think is a problem. right? So the first step is to really understand what it is that the kid is experiencing. And then once you have co-regulated, right, your anxiety is down, their emotion is down, then you can begin to problem solve collaboratively about a mutually identified problem. But a lot of parents will jump in and be that, prefrontal cortex too soon, right? And they will say, I know what the problem is. So here's what we're going to do. And the kids, flailing around going, no, you don't understand.
Right.
You don't understand. You're not listening to me. And they would be 100% correct, right? So having that air of curiosity while you're regulating your own emotional experience, because when a kid, when anyone comes to us in a high expressed emotional state, our emotions are going to react, right? We feel out of control, we feel anxious ourselves, we feel uncomfortable, right? So as we're allowing the space for the kid to tell us more, we can be doing whatever we need to do to regulate our own emotional intensity. And bring that frontal cortex back online, because once we get to a high emotional state, that prefrontal cortex shuts down, and neither party can reason their way through the apparent problem. A lot of times I find if we just kind of sit and listen, ask a few questions, the kid will de-escalate pretty quickly and say, and then at the end you could say, is there anything that you need from me? They say, no, I just needed to vent. And they can walk away, right? But if we jump in and start problem solving, and then they start to say, well, no, you're not listening to me. Just listen, stop doing that. No, don't call my teacher. No, don't call Susie's parents. No, that's not what I mean, right? And so we have to sit back, take that moment and just listen, actively listen, right? And listening not to have a response, but listen to understand. That's what validation is, listening to understand, right? Now, and we may never fully understand somebody else's emotional experience. It might not make sense, but we can try to say, gosh, if I was in that situation, I might have that same feeling. I might have that same thought.
Yeah, I want to say that, one of the deep, downstairs brain systems that parents have that we're hardwired to protect our children when we see them in distress. So that's an automatic response. The part about mindfulness and being aware of our responses is regulating that automatic impulsive response to jump in and save, because that doesn't encourage problem solving. And in fact, what that often does, and we see this, anxiety is a highly contagious psychophysiological state. And we've all had the experience of, and I see this all the time, at the hospital where a kid is expressing some distress, the parent then comes in with heightened anxiety, and now the anxiety is kind of mushroomed. Or sometimes I call it, that anxiety is like the hot potato in the family system. So a kid might have it, unconsciously throws it to mom gets super anxious, the kid is relieved of it. So being mindful of your state and not responding out of a state of anxiety, which again is based on an imagined fear that is causing your body to react as if you were in imminent danger. So just, Tracy mentioned that just as the mind or the brain can affect the body can affect the brain. Using the body for movement can be very useful. And using techniques like sometimes when we're very upset, putting cold water on our wrists, or at the hospital, one of the things we use a lot at DBT is we have frozen oranges. So when someone gets very upset and we have them start, rubbing it on their arm, it shifts the attention to the sensory system rather than to the emotional system. And here's some suggestions of, by the way, I really like this book, Parenting from the Inside Out by Dan Siegel. It really gets into doing the work to really appreciate, one, how we were parented affects our parenting, particularly when we're in a state of stress, because we tend to resort to old brain, deeply ingrained patterns about how we were responded to when we were in a state of distress. So I'm going to stop here and stop sharing my screen. We can.
Yeah, I just the consequences of what a kid will experience or an adult will experience as an invalidating environment are that they begin to not trust their own emotional experience, right? So if and much of our invalidation is inadvertent. We don't mean to be doing it, but these kind of throwaway or non-mindful comments, like say a kid comes home with a bad grade on a test, right? We'll say something like, well, just study more next time and you'll be fine, right? Or you know, oh, don't worry about it. It's just one test. You know, you have the whole semester to go, right? Those seem, you know, like comforting statements. But to the kid, there's no acknowledgement that they are worried for some reason about that test grade. There's no acknowledgement of that. So that inadvertently is invalidating. And you may see what you think is a comforting response. They may be, you know, they may get more angry, and you're thinking, what? I'm telling you it's okay. It's going to be okay. That should be enough, right? The kid needs to be acknowledged that maybe the anxiety that they're feeling is actually, it makes sense. Of course, I know that you studied really hard for that test. That test meant a lot to you. I get it, right? Just that one statement, that one acknowledgement that what they're feeling makes sense on some level. That's all the difference. If you start with that, then you can go into strategies, skills, techniques, all of that. But that one validating statement, just acknowledging that what the kid is experiencing makes sense to you. Okay?
Yeah, another term for that connecting is attunement. We're tuning to the emotional state of the child. That's another reason why, you know, pet therapy works. Animals have a great ability, because their language doesn't get in the way and their thinking brain doesn't get in the way, of being very attuned.
Right. Yeah.
And it's comforting.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. We forgot to mention that we love questions. So wanted to open it up because Frank and I could literally talk all day. But I wanted to open the floor up to questions before we go too much further. Are there any questions? You can do all sorts of things to get our attention. You can do the little raised hand thing. I don't actually know how to do that, but I know it's on here somewhere.
Stacy, will you monitor that?
There's a chat function if you want to ask questions in the chat, or you can unmute yourself. So feel free if anyone has any questions. I actually would start off with a question that to ask. When you talk about parents wanting to, you know, automatically help and jump in and save our kids, do you have any tips for parents on how not to do that?
Yeah, take a deep breath.
Yeah.
We start with taking a deep breath.
Right.
And tune into our own physiological state and notice I'm anxious. And what is that about? Am I worried that somehow my child will fail? And I feel threatened by the possibility they could fail this test. And now I'm going to bring this anxiety to this experience, and it generally doesn't improve performance. And generally, the child will take on the anxiety of the parent and now become concerned both about how they're doing and how their parent will react.
Yeah. Yeah, it's tough. I think if you have to really be doing two things at one time, you have to be regulating your own emotion, while actively listening to the kid and getting them to tell you a little bit more, right? One thing that I have tried is to just shelve the problem for a minute and go and do something that you know is going to soothe both of you. So in our house, that's making a cup of tea. Gosh, let's get some tea so we can talk about that. And just the act of saying, you know, I'm going to focus on, you pick out the tea, right? The kid goes to the tea drawer, gets out the kind of tea they want. Mom, what do you want? Okay, start the kettle, pick out the mug that you want. You know, just that is going to allow for your emotion to come down. So whatever the equivalent, it might be tossing a ball back and forth. Woof, this is time to get the ball. Go get the ball. Let's toss it back and forth. Okay, tell me more. Just that little bit of distraction lets your mind know this is not a crisis. Now, of course, you're not going to do this if you're in an actual crisis, right? But if these are the everyday things that are making everybody upset these days, letting your brain know, letting that amygdala know, there's no crisis here. No crisis. We're actually so not in a crisis that we're going to go make a cup of tea, right? It's a really powerful message, not only to yourself and your brain, but to the kid that we're gonna work on this, but it's not a crisis where we need to be, you know, all hands on deck, overly emotional. We're going to make a cup of tea and talk about this, right? So just that little bit of activity time allows the frontal cortex to come back. And that might be, let's go and walk around the house 3 times outside, get that little bit of, you know, fresh air on our face. So whatever it is in your family, getting the message across that no crisis here, let's go do something to help us have a more reasonable and effective conversation.
And sometimes first we acknowledge that it may feel like a crisis.
Right.
It may feel like a crisis to them. And again, we focus on calming down. And then once we have better regulation, we can then do something that we call, let's check the facts. Let's take a look at this. But to do that too prematurely is going to be essentially that kind of invalidation that Tracy talked about, because it feels like a crisis. And doesn't mean feelings are not always facts, but we first want to regulate. Because if you then tell someone it's not a crisis, we all have this experience, right? We're worried about someone and someone says, don't worry about it.
Right.
Right? Where does that leave us? Now we might feel embarrassed about being worried about it, but it doesn't tend to help us.
Right. And, you know, you may have a kid that likes you to rescue them. So, you know, you might have to shape or reshape the behavior that if you choose as a family to move out of that problem-solving mode in the service of helping your kid to be able to regulate and manage their emotions more effectively on their own, because someday they're going to be on their own, right? And you want to make sure that not only are they academically prepared, we have so much focus in our communities about academic preparedness, but we don't give as much credence to emotional preparedness, right? So these are kids, every single one of our kids, no matter whether, you know, they leave the house and go far away, or they stay in the house but they enter a job, all of this is, we're not going to be there. And they're going to have to learn to manage their emotions without us on board. So that's the goal of moving out of problem solving mode, right? You want to move into a more collaborative problem solving, but first, how do we manage our emotional experience? But that might be hard for some families who have set up that mom solves all of my problems. And I like it. I don't want mom to stop solving problems. They may give you some pushback. So that might be you might need some help in mediating that and really kind of weighing the pros and cons of moving out of that, you know, superhero, super mom or super dad mode.
Great. Thank you. We have another question here. How do you manage emotions that are driven by or exacerbated by the teen tween hormones?
you figure out which hill you want to die on, right?
Mhm.
And you got to ignore probably, I don't know, what percentage would you say? I'd say 85% of what the kids, that those hormones drive the most provocative statements that you're ever going to hear, like the most outlandish, provocative statements. You just got to be like all Matrix and just like, woo, just let it go right by, right? And don't get hung up on everything they say, right? You don't have to respond to everything they say. It's not necessary. It's not in the parenting handbook. You don't have to have a response to everything. Some things you can literally just ignore. And if it's these, highly provocative, highly outrageous statements, don't respond.
It can also be a time to educate about those periods of vulnerability. So as Tracy mentioned, every day we're being confronted by certain stressors, the pandemic being one of them. So we're all in a state of heightened vulnerability. Those times we're at greater risk for emotional dysregulation. So sometimes talking to your child and saying, I don't know if you're talking about particular kinds of hormones, but I was thinking about, premenstrual stress, even having the awareness that during those periods, no pun intended, you might be at heightened vulnerability for, emotional dysregulation.
Yeah.
And, how do you take care of yourself during those times?
Right. And I think one of the most valuable gifts we can give our parents, give our kids as parents, is to acknowledge when we have ineffective moments, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I had early on in the pandemic, I couldn't get some bread. And I had a complete and utter meltdown literally over a loaf of bread, right? It was historic. And I had to say to my family, after I was able to regulate myself, that was ridiculous. I totally get it. That was such an overreaction. Here's why, I'm feeling this, I'm feeling that, I'm feeling that. So acknowledging when we have an overreaction, right? Or when we behave ineffectively, or when we say something that maybe wasn't so nice, right? Even if it was provoked by the kid, doesn't matter. Saying, I'm sorry, I messed that up. That was a bad moment. That was a bad Tracy moment.
I flipped my lid.
I did. Yeah. Right. 10 fingers out at that point. Right. Yeah.
And that leads to repair, by the way.
Right.
So we can't constantly be in fact, I think being kind of in attunement 30% of the time can lead to good attachment and connection. There are times when we're not in attunement with our spouses, with people important to us, and with our children. And what's important is the repair piece. So, what Tracy is saying, when we lose it, being able to go back and say, I flipped my lid, I'm sorry I said that, and I'm going to do better next time. I'll take a breath before. And that's one of the differences in kind of the more contemporary parenting approach, is treating ourselves first,
Mm-hmm.
is getting ourselves calm before we go and try to get someone else calm. It's not going to work. It
Mm-hmm.
escalates. We've all had this experience. We've had it with our spouses, that's how we end up getting enraged.
Right. Some of you, if you have older children, as I do, you might have the experience where, they'll text you or worse, call you at 11 o'clock at night, because that's just when they're kind of sitting down to maybe start their homework, or, they're chilling out and something pops in their head and they text you. Well, please do not text me or call me after 9:30, because I am not going to be able to manage that. So I had to shape my kids, and turn my phone off, right? That I am not good. I am not capable at that hour of the night. So I can't be the person that you go to, because I won't be able to help you, and then I in turn am going to have a restless night's sleep, and then it just escalates the next morning. So really kind of setting limits about what you can and can't do, right? We're not asking you guys to be superheroes. Again, you shouldn't need to be calm all the time. We are all struggling through this, this life that we're given. So if you can't do it, tap out and say, not a great time for me. Maybe you could ask, if you have a spouse in the house, or maybe you could contact your friend or somebody else, know what your circle of support is, because you can't do it all. And if you try, you're going to fail.
Yeah, in fact, there's a growing body of research around the need for parents to have their own support group, if you will. And, one of the things that can lead us to become dysregulated, as Tracy mentioned, is loneliness, disconnection, and, the appreciation that caregivers need care. And this is true whether you're in the mental health field, teachers, anywhere you're lending yourself to take care of other people. It's important to have ways to fill our own tanks. And, and that might mean sometimes, if one of my children say something to me and I might say, I don't know how to respond to that right now. I need some time. Or it's perfectly okay if your child says, what do I do about this? And say, I don't know.
Right.
I'm not sure. Let's see if we can think of something together. Or right now I need to sort of cool down a little bit, and then we'll spend some time thinking about this.
Right.
Great. Thank you. We have another question here. What if the child is too upset in the moment to talk and resists efforts to calm themselves down? What can you do?
What age child are we talking about?
It doesn't say, but given we're, our age right now, we're targeting 10 to 14. So I think in that age, or if you'd like to tell me, you can send it to me privately and I can let them know.
Tracy, you take that one.
Oh, here we go. 11.
11. Yeah. That's where getting active, I think, is, would be a good strategy. Totally distracting and do something non-talk related, right? So tossing a ball back and forth. We have I keep in my office a balance board. I know they have them at Silver Hill. We use these all the time. You can get them, Amazon for like $15. It's just this round thing that's on a ball, and you have to get on it and try and balance. It's a great thing to have around the house. Just pull it out, have the kid get on the balance board, because again, it moves you out of that headspace into your body, because you have to engage a lot of different muscles in order to stay balanced on the board. So something like that. If you have a little mini trampoline, or if you have a trampoline outside, don't tell your pediatrician. They hate trampolines, but they're great for just that, immediate response. You could jump rope, doing something physical with your kid, minor. If you have a treadmill, just maybe setting it on low and getting on the treadmill for a minute or so. But really, I think getting physical to release some of that energy is the first order of business. And again, and that allows you also to regulate while you're just doing this activity. Right. And honestly, if the kid is resistant to doing anything, as long as they're not in danger of hurting themselves, you say something like, sweetheart, love you to bits. I'm here if you need me, but I'm going to go make myself a cup of tea. Right. Or I'm going to go and check on dinner. I'm here if you need me.
With older kids, it's critical to determine whether it's what we call an upstairs or downstairs tantrum. So toddlers have downstairs tantrums. They don't have the cognitive ability to have an upstairs tantrum where that can be related to getting something that they want. So it's very different. So sometimes our kids will learn that if I do X, Y, and Z, I will get what I want. That is a different kind of tantrum. That's an upstairs tantrum. That's the ones that we typically use more traditional parenting techniques like boundaries. And what Tracy's saying, the answer is no, you're not getting this. And I appreciate you're disappointed. But that's my final no. And what tends to happen is inadvertently when kids start escalating, again, that rescue urge comes in and we tend to then give in. And what we're actually doing is reinforcing a certain kind of behavior.
Mm-hmm.
So it's important when we think about older kids, like a 11-year-old, even 7 or 8-year-old, this difference between a top-down versus bottom-up tantrum. When it's a bottom-up, it's much more about calming down. On the upstairs, it's a little more about sort of setting some boundaries or saying, when you're ready, we can talk about this more. But the answer is no.
Good words of wisdom. Thank you. We have one more question here. Does low self-esteem play a role in anxiety in older teens?
Well, again, you want to take it, Tracy?
No, you can start, Frank.
Okay. Again, we have to talk about what kinds of anxiety. So anxiety is an experience we all get to have. And there's certain kinds of anxiety that's very useful. So when we think about performance, anxiety kind of follows like a bell curve. Anxiety can increase our performance in some ways because it causes us to prepare. But at a certain point, it can undermine. And if you have the experience of having, being undermined, it can undermine your sense of what we call self-efficacy, that I can do something. And so, more significant kinds of anxiety undermines that piece. That I'm effective in my world. You
Right.
take it, Tracy.
Yeah, and I think any mood disorder that actually, like what Frank is talking about, that anxiety that has gotten to the point where it might be a clinical anxiety, right? Something that is impacting all areas of your life, that is certainly going to impact our sense of self, our sense of capability, right? Because our experience of the world is very difficult, and things that seem to come easily to other kids don't come easily to us. So we begin to feel like I'm not okay, right? So I think that I would say probably the chronic anxiety comes before the low self-esteem, mm-hmm. rather than the low self-esteem of, bringing on anxiety.
Yeah, agreed.
Thank you. We have one more question that popped up. What do you do if the child is upset about an irrational fear of something bad happening?
That is tough. I mean, so many of my clients, Frank, I'm sure you're hearing this. I mean, it's very hard to discern these days what is irrational fear, because there's just no solid answers like that is not going to happen. Right? Mm-hmm. So that whole checking the facts, we have to really kind of break it down to a more manageable level, because I can't say with all honesty and faith to a kid that is never going to happen, right? Because the world has gone so topsy-turvy that, we just don't know from day to day what is going to happen. So, I think acknowledging that these are really, really, really scary, frightening, uncertain times, first, and then saying, what is it that we are doing in our family, in our town, to stay safe from the potential bad things that are happening. So bringing it back down to what can we do in our house? What can we do in our community? What are they doing in your school to keep you safe as possible? So that, bringing it down to the more micro level rather than dealing with these big macro problems. What ifs, all the what ifs. There's so many what ifs, but let's see what we're doing to stay safe. Home, school, community. I wouldn't go beyond that, especially with little kids.
Yeah.
Okay. We have a few more questions coming in. I know we're a little bit over an hour, so I have two more here. What do you do when your child thinks you are playing the psychiatrist game and refuses to play along? When you're trying to just listen and let them problem solve? Basically saying kind of, stop it, mom, you're patronizing me. Something similar to those words.
I just have to apologize for a minute. I have to sign off. I have another appointment that was scheduled right at 10:30. So I wanted to say thank you, and I'll leave you in the capable hands of Tracy.
Oh, great. You sign off when I have to answer the psychiatrist question.
Yeah, I know. That's quick.
Thank you, Frank.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, that gets a little bit to the what I was speaking about earlier, that you may have a kid that doesn't want you to move away from problem solving. And the key is you have to find a language that doesn't seem phony, fake, inauthentic, right? So I don't even say in my practice as a clinician, as a therapist, how does that make you feel? That, no offense to anybody that uses that phrase. If it works for you, that's great. It kind of makes me, uncomfortable. So I don't use that phrase. I just don't use that phrase. How does that make you feel? Right? So you have to find language because this is an important developmental tool that you're giving your kids. They may feel like it's patronizing. That's okay. They're entitled to not like what you're doing. They can survive. And maybe it's about telling them that, this is why I'm doing this. I'm doing this because it's my job as a parent to make sure that you can manage in the world once you leave this house, right? So Mark Brackett, who developed the ruler system that New Canaan schools are using, he tells a story about how when he was growing up, his parents weren't particularly concerned whether he was happy or not. And I had the same experience. Doesn't mean my parents were bad or ineffective. Their job, they felt, was to make sure that I was capable of managing myself in the world, right? And they gave me some really valuable tools because they weren't particularly concerned whether I was happy. That was my job, right? So if your kid is unhappy because of something you're doing, that's okay. They're not going to perish, right? So not to be swayed if they give you pushback and say, I don't like it when you talk like that. Maybe an explanation, hey, here's why I'm talking like this, but maybe I can find some language that doesn't feel as patronizing. But not stepping away because they say, I don't like it.
Great, thank you, Tracy. We have one last question and then we'll wrap it up if that works.
That works for me.
All right, can an older teen outgrow negative anxiety, or is this something they must grapple with for life?
That's a great question. It depends whether it is an actual anxiety disorder or whether it is more anxiety that doesn't kind of meet the qualifications for a disorder. Usually anxious kids are anxious from when they're little kids. We start to see it manifest more in middle school, and then we see another uptick about sophomore year in high school. And the thing about why it's tricky is we keep little kids in a more supportive and secure environment. And then, so we may not see as much their anxiety when they're littler. You're going to see it start to escalate when they're challenged more socially and academically, when the challenges become more intense, right? So that's when, if you think your child is anxious and maybe anxious to a point where they might have a anxiety disorder, I would have it checked out. Pediatricians do a lot of screening for anxiety. You don't even have to go to see a therapist. Although, it's always great to see a therapist, but check it out, right? So if it is in the disorder category, that's a chronic condition, right? And you're going to have to manage it throughout your life. It can go into remission with treatment. But you'll see it flare up again during times of heavy stress. So it's a great question. It's a tough question to just answer with a pat answer because it's really so dependent on the kid. So I would say if you have a question about your kid's anxiety and it seems to be impacting them more than the norm or the typical these days, I would absolutely encourage everybody to have it checked out.
Great. Thank you, Tracy.
You're welcome. Thanks
Well,
everybody for coming in today.
yes, a big thank you to Tracy and Frank for joining us today. And thank you all for joining us as well.
Stay safe, everybody.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.